Good morning. Welcome to the seminar. My name is Rhonda Riley. I'm on the seminar committee, and I'm here to introduce Dr. Rick Stevenson. He was here last week and was gracious enough to return and finish his presentation. Dr. Stevenson has a PhD from Michigan State University and a doctorate in divinity from Southern California School of Ministry, and 2 master's degrees, and is a wonderful speaker. If you were here last week, you heard him. We're very happy to have him come back, and I'm looking forward to hearing the rest of the presentation. And this week, we're going to do things a little bit differently. We're going to ask people to hold, so that he can finish his presentation, hold your questions until the end. And instead of us walking around with a mic, come at the end, and we'll stop about 10 minutes before the hour is over and line up, and you can ask your questions. And I'm looking forward to it. Thank you all for coming, and I'll turn it over to Dr. Stevenson.
Good morning. I am so humbled to be here. When I got the email from whomever sent me the email to invite me back, it literally brought tears to my eyes. Being a Black man in America all of my life, and experiencing what it means to be Black and male, watching what my dad experienced and my grandfather, to know that there are people who are interested in being allies changes the way we live life. So I want you to know that I am so humbled that you would consider engaging again further in this conversation. Because if we're going to change the world in which we live, we can't do it in sections. We have to coalesce our gifts and talents, etc. And so won't you just give your own self a big round of applause for willing to come back after this at church and go on. Secondly, I'm being graded. One of my former students is here, and I know she's going to be grading me. So if I don't do well, it's her fault. So last week we began looking at this whole notion of diversity, equity, inclusion, and cultural competency, and so on, and we didn't get as far as I wanted to go. So I want to go back and I want to set a couple things in context. First of all, relationships that have success and relationships that are healthy are relationships that are built on honesty and history. Any of you who are in relationships with other people, whether it be your spouse, your significant other, the more you know about that person, the easier it is to build relationships and trust. Well, one of the problems that we have here in the US is that we don't know how to build relationships cross-racially and cross-culturally. And so I want to give you a little bit of history and then get into some concepts of how we can begin to work together as a team. So I don't know if you know this guy right here. His name is Thomas Jefferson. He wrote that document called the Declaration of Independence, right? But I want you to listen to what he says here. He says, it is declared and enacted that no person unborn or under the age of 12 years at the passage of this act, and who with mentis compass shall, after the age of 15, be a citizen of this Commonwealth until he or she can read readily in some tongue, native or acquired. So the law says this: you can't be a citizen unless you can read. Okay? Which means you can't own property, can't marry, can't get a loan, etc. And then a law was passed that said you can't teach African people to read. Okay? So now you have this system of separation, right? And what I think a lot of people misunderstand about how we function in America is there's a difference between race, being a racist, and racism, right? Racism is a set of systems, right? Now, on the other side of that, you have, how many of you know who Frederick Douglass was? What? I love y'all already. I may have to come back here again. All right. So So Frederick Douglass says, knowledge makes a man or a woman unfit to be a slave, right? So we have to understand then that one of the ways that we separate one another is by keeping each other undereducated. Not only undereducated philosophically or historically, but about one another, right? If you see me as a criminal, and we'll talk a little bit about that if I get to this part, and Reconstruction, where Blackness was criminalized, then you never get a chance to see my heart. You never get a chance to know who I am. And for the most part, we know more about each other based on how we see people as opposed to how much we know because we've been with them. Does that make sense? So, how many of you are familiar with the United Daughters of the Confederacy? Okay. The United, can I show you a quick video? All right. The United Daughters of the, is the sound going to come right through here? And I'm not on, I don't think I'm on your Wi-Fi. You want to do that? Why don't you set that up? The United Daughters of the Confederacy are the ladies who raised the money that built and installed all those statues in the South. Okay? But what is more important about them is they controlled the textbooks. They determined what made. Can't you just love it? Go ahead, go ahead.
It's Bob Ryan.
It's Bertrand, okay. So they controlled the textbooks. They controlled what people were taught from the first grade all the way up to colleges. And they dictated what was in those textbooks. And so because they had an agenda, a lot of what we learned was under accurate. That was good, huh? Write that down. Okay, you ready? Mm-hmm. Thank you. All right, so we're gonna watch this. We'll watch the video, and then we'll come back and I'll go further. Make this bigger.
This textbook describes slavery. The master often had a barbecue or a picnic for his slaves. Then they had a great frolic. In the fields, they sang songs. The beat of the music and the richness of their voices made work seem light.
Yes, that's from History of Georgia, a textbook published in 1954 that was taught across junior high schools in Georgia for decades. That sort of language is part of an intellectual movement called the Lost Cause, a distorted version of American Civil War history that's been prevalent in the South for a long time. It took shape soon after the defeat of the Confederate States in the war, when Southern historians like Edward Pollard and former Confederate General Jubal Early started preserving the South's perspective through their writings. They framed the Confederate cause as a heroic defense of the Southern way of life against the overwhelming forces in the North. That narrative has a few basic tenets: the glorification of Confederate soldiers who died for a cause they believed in, the belief that slavery was a benevolent institution, and maybe most importantly, that slavery was not the root cause of the war. The Lost Cause is one of the most notoriously effective efforts to rewrite history, and it was done by the losing side. So how did it become so deeply rooted in Southern memory? Blame the United Daughters of the Confederacy. The UDC was founded in Nashville in 1894 to preserve Confederate culture for generations to come. The women who made up the group descended from elite antebellum families, and they used their social and political clout to spread the pro-Southern version of the war as real history. You've probably seen their efforts to honor the Confederacy, but maybe you didn't know it was the UDC. They're the ones who covered the Southern landscape with memorials for Confederate leaders and soldiers. They used their fundraising and lobbying skills to pressure local governments into erecting monuments in prominent public spaces like courthouses and state capitals.
Installed here next to the state capitol by the United Daughters of the Confederacy.
The United Daughters of the Confederacy donated this memorial to the city back in the 30s.
They put them along roadsides and in parks. Any place that was remotely relevant to the Confederacy was memorialized. By the early 20th century, the UDC had 100,000 members in chapters spread all over the country, but mostly in former Confederate states. And there's a reason they grew so quickly during that time.
So we're talking about roughly 3 decades after the end of the war, and the Confederate veterans themselves are beginning to die off. So there is this push to find ways to commemorate it, because the big challenge by 1900 was there's a new generation of white Southerners being born, and they never experienced the war years.
That push is visible. Most of the Confederate monuments were erected during the UDC's height of influence.
There's a rhetoric around monuments that we want to get this thing built before all of that generation has died off. And the reason we want it is to teach future generations about those men.
Dr. Karen Cox wrote the book on the UDC, and I asked her if it was fair to say the group established the lost cause as historical fact in the South.
Oh my God, yeah, they were the leaders of the lost cause into the 20th century, and they made it a movement about vindication.
Just to give you an idea of how effective they were, they successfully lobbied for a Confederate memorial in Arlington National Cemetery, which U.S. President Woodrow Wilson proudly unveiled to a cheering crowd. And that's influence, right?
Monuments are the least of what they did.
What?
I mean, they are the most visible and tangible, but the work with children was far more influential.
It turns out a central UDC objective is shaping how children think about the war and their Southern heritage. One of their most powerful tools, textbooks. Take a look at this pamphlet called A Measuring Rod for Textbooks. It was written by the illustrious Southern historian, Miss Mildred Rutherford, an educator, orator, and author of Southern history textbooks. She's also very pro-slavery. The pamphlet announced the formation of a textbook review committee featuring prominent Southerners, like 5 former Confederate generals. This group was committed to spreading the truths of Confederate history, so they instructed school boards to reject any textbooks that did not accord full justice to the South. And they urged libraries to deface every book in their collection that didn't measure up by writing the words "unjust to the South" clearly on its cover. This pamphlet was shared widely with school boards throughout the South, and UDC-backed committees closely monitored history books to make sure Northern influence never reached classrooms. So the core language of an approved textbook aligned precisely with that of the lost cause. You know, stuff like,
the Confederacy lost in the war between the states, but Georgia never forgot to honor their Confederate soldiers.
History of Georgia was on the UDC's approved list. It was also written by E. Merton Coulter, a self-described Southern historian and historian-described white supremacist.
They understand that who wins the writing game, who wins the battle over history, ultimately wins the war. That's the big fight for the UDC.
But their work with children went further than the classrooms. The UDC formed an auxiliary group called the Children of the Confederacy, which was designed to get kids born in former Confederate states to actively participate in their version of history. Group leaders had kids recite call and response truths from something called the Confederate Catechism. Children up to the age of 18 would compete and be rewarded for memorizing long passages of lost cause rhetoric.
So it would be like an after-school thing, you know, like that was your club. You would go after school to the meeting of the Children of the Confederacy, and your leader might teach you songs of the South, like Dixie or other songs that were considered Southern patriotic songs. They would have them write essays, go visit the veterans, and learn this catechism.
Children were also the centerpiece of their community's monument unveilings, like this living flag at the dedication of the Stonewall Jackson Monument in Richmond. Yes, those are school children. The UDC's efforts shaped the identities of children who grew up with the lost cause. They made history personal, and that made their story last longer.
Generations of children learning that narrative in a variety of ways grow up to be, you know, segregationists in the 50s and 60s, because that's been drilled into them since they were children.
After World War I, the UDC started losing steam, but the damage was done. The monuments were in place, and the textbooks they wrote remained in Southern classrooms until the late 70s. And the Women's Group did it all without the right to vote or participate in politics.
You can still get glimmers of this lost cause memory of the war from people who choose to see it through the personal. And I think the UDC, to a great extent, that was their goal.
So the next time someone says the Confederate monuments are about remembering our history, just know that that's exactly what the United Daughters of the Confederacy wants you to think.
Okay, so How many of you knew that? Right. So what happens to a child who grows up under that teaching, right? They automatically assume that the teacher is right and they're not going to question it. And then they pass that on to their children and on and on and on. I am a historian. I'm trained as a historian. I don't believe the statue should have been torn down. I just think that the monuments should have been put up with the right information, right? I'm a diver, and a lot of work I do is on slave ships underwater. I don't disturb the site, right? I don't want to bring up the cannon. I don't want to bring up the shackles. I don't want to disturb the site, but I do want to maintain the information for its accuracy. And I think that one of the things that has happened in America is because there weren't a lot of women writing history, there weren't a lot of people of African descent, Asian descent writing history. It was controlled by a certain group of people, and they had a narrative. So therefore, if that's what you've been taught, it's normal, right? I was just talking to a young lady who was telling me that her daughter is one of her family members is biracial, but they're Jamaican. And she said, I just learned that all Black people aren't alike. Well, guess what? We ain't, right? There, right? There is a difference between Jamaicans and Bahamians and Haitians, right? We may have the same complexion, but our cultures are different. And so those are some of the fundamental things that I want to talk about and help you better understand why we need to do what we're doing here. Does that make sense? Okay, let me put this up real quick. I'm acting like I can see through my glasses. I'll get to that later. Okay, so one of the reasons that I'm here is to first kind of lay a better foundation of African and African American studies and why we do it, and then how that relates, how that equates to you and I building relationships cross culturally. African American studies is an academic discipline which seeks to investigate and interrogate the world from an Afrocentric perspective. Afrocentricity means this, that rather than looking at the people of African descent on the periphery, you bring their experience to the center of the conversation, not to the exclusion of others, but to show how we connect, right? The resulting findings are transposed into communally digestible data, which will ultimately liberate the African community and cause it to see its self-worth. What we failed to realize during slavery is these people were actually treated like property. You could get a mortgage on a person. There were Black people who were rented out, right? How many of you knew that, right? You could rent a person out. Now, imagine how your life would have been if you were treated like your dog. Well, some of you treat your dogs pretty good. They had a dog cemetery, right? But imagine, if you will, New Year's Eve, December 31st, plantation owners about to close the books and they realize they haven't made enough money. We haven't picked enough cotton. We haven't harvested enough sugar. We haven't harvested enough tobacco. And someone's going to be sold, right? Maybe your daughter, maybe your son, maybe your husband. That is the kind of dynamic that is underlying the separation between Black and white communities, right? My great-grandfather was a slave. I never met him, but I knew about him because my grandmother told me about him. And some of the things that she shared with me didn't make sense at the time because I was still a kid. But as I grew older and I began to study this, I couldn't understand how people could treat people like that. And so for a long time in my life, I was angry. I was angry at white America because I didn't understand why they would treat my parents and grandparents that way. My dad told me about lynching. And when I went away to college, where's the young lady from Wilkes-Barre? I was just talking to someone outside from Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. Okay, don't worry about it. I was an athlete. Dad said, be careful when you go up there because there are a lot of white people up there, not that many black people, and stay away from white women. Why, Dad? Because your life can be changed immediately simply because you've been accused of doing something you may not have done. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with the Omaha race riots. This man was accused of raping a white girl. Now, if you notice, they're not hiding their faces because lynchings were a festival. They were opportunities to fellowship. This man was lynched, he was set on fire. This particular lynching, the lady was trying to protect her husband, and they also lynched her son. Here's another lynching in Minnesota. And most of these lynchings occurred around the notion that this black man assaulted a white woman. Hey, when you get up there, you stay away from the white girls because I don't want you to experience what I know can happen to a black man. So I grow up with this hatred for white women because I'm afraid that if I meet somebody and we begin to build a fellowship up in State College in the 70s, that's not going to work too well for me, right? My second week at Penn State University, the KKK from Bellefonte drove through downtown State College with signs, we don't want none of y'all downtown after dark. Well, there you know what I'm talking about. And then I go to seminary and I meet the professor who literally changes my life, a white historian who says, man, you got a real gift. Now, here's my point. All of us have to have some kind of connection with a person who can help bridge that gap and void some of the other stuff. Not that it didn't happen, right? But we have to be able to say, you know what? I can't live my dad's experience. I have to live the experience that God has given me, right? Yeah, I love my dad. My dad was the greatest man on the planet. My dad worked 3 jobs, take care of his family. The way he loved my mother is the way I wanted to love my wife. I've always wanted to be in love with a woman. It's going out like my dad was with my mother. And so I learned that from him. But I also learned to be fearful, right, of women. But I had to have my own experience. And the point is that when we start talking about coalition, when we begin to talk about crossing cultures, when we start talking about crossing racial lines, we have to have our own experiences. We cannot allow what someone else experienced to taint what God's trying to do with us. If we call ourselves Christians, we got to take risks. This thing is not easy. I really appreciate the fact that you invited me back and that you want to have this conversation. But let me tell you something. This is hard work, right? And some of us are over 20, so right? It's gonna have these issues, right? How many of you familiar with the Casual Killing Act? Never heard of it. Whereas the only law enforced for the punishment of refractory servant or someone who's recalcitrant, resisting their master, mistress, or overseer cannot be inflicted upon Negroes, nor the absence of many of them by other than violent means. Watch this. Be enacted and declared by this grand assembly, if any slave resist his master or other, masters or correcting his overseer, and by the extremity of the correction should chance to die, that his death shall not be accomplished or a felony, but the master be acquitted from molestation, since it cannot be presumed that his pretense was malice. It says this: if I run away and the overseer pursues me and I resist, and then he kills me, it's not a felony. Now, why is that? Because in some cases, especially during the internal slave trade, it was cheaper to buy another one if you killed one than it was to property. Now, most of you didn't know that. And the question is why? Because if we continue to remove aspects of African American history from the historical books, your grandchildren and great-grandchildren won't know it either. And what they will learn is to despise and hate people that don't look like them. And they won't even know why. And one of the reasons that they won't know why is because we're not taught to ask questions, right? I met one of the students who's here today. I hope she's going to give me an A. And one of the things I do in my teaching is I teach through inquiry, asking questions, because I want my students to be critical. I want them to analyze data, but I want to know what they think. But also, I want them to know that what they have to say is important, because we build relationship by having an environment where it's comfortable to ask questions and where it's comfortable to not know the answer. It's okay not to know. The problem is when you don't know, and then you have an opportunity to get information and you decide not to accept it, that's called cognitive dissonance. You have the ability to change the information, but you desire, no, I'm going to keep on doing this anyway. Why? Because you benefit from the oppression. You tracking with me? Okay. Now, what escapes many people is the whimsical killing of enslaved people or blacks and during slavery. And even after by whites, white folks without punitive consequence, is based on laws passed by white politicians who happen to be plantation owners. I just showed you a number of slides of lynchings. And one of the reasons that those people were willing to take a picture is because they wouldn't have been punished, right? So what happens when you have kids there and they see this? Then they grow up thinking it's okay to do that because daddy did it, because granddaddy did it, so it must be okay for me. And unless we change that narrative, we continue to perpetuate that sin, because that's what it is. It's sin, right? So here's the first point I want you to begin to internalize as a principle. When Reverend McClendon sent me the email the first time to come, I think I told you, I checked y'all out, right? I went on Google. Right? I Googled y'all, and I'm like, first of all, you were closer than I thought you were. But I was looking through the congregation and going through the gallery and going through the pictures. I said, there's nobody in the room that looks like me. And then the Lord said to me, that's a great place to go. Right? Was I afraid to come? Absolutely. Not because I don't know what I'm doing. I've been in ministry almost 40 years. I was afraid that you couldn't hear what I had to say because of what I look like. Because sometimes we shut each other down before we get a chance to know each other, because we've been trained to judge people by appearance. So one of the things I want to put into your toolbox is allow yourself to go beyond the for the inside, right? I got to use you, Suze. So Suze was one of my students. And I'm so proud of her. She's a grad school student. She's knocking it out the park, right? And when she wanted to apply for grad school, I wrote a reference for her because I saw her potential. And I could have said, she's a white woman, I know it, right? I could have said that. But would there have been God? Right? God is not a racist. God is not sexist. God does not function under any of that stuff that keeps us separated. Jesus died for all of us. And I think that one of the things I learned about my role as a preacher, pastor, professor, is that God is constantly challenging me to cross these lines because someone's got to do it. Someone's got to be willing to go into a place where you might get rejected and still do it anyway. Because even Jesus had one that turned his back on him. And I sure enough ain't Jesus. Right? So I wanna put into your mind, into your heart, the importance of allowing people to be who they are based on who they are. Find out, I was standing over here, and I got to tell you, 5 or 6 people came over and they shook my hand and thanked me for coming back, and it was so warm, right? I'm still a black man in America, and yet there are those of you in this room today who have the kind of heart that we need to change the society, to change the world, but it requires education. It requires the ability to trust how history has separated us and learn that history, knowing it well, can bring us together. How many of you know what a griot is? Griot, G-R-I-O-T, right? Okay. In Senegal, West Africa, griots are buried in a tree. They bury them there because they are storytellers, they're historians, they maintain the history of the tribe. And they bury them in a tree because if you put them in the ground, it says you're burying the knowledge. In Haiti, griot is not a person, it's food. Who knew that? Yo, right? So what does that say? The same term can have an etymological difference based on the culture. So to say that all, quote, white people are the same is just as crazy as to say all black people are the same. We have to be willing, watch this, to be rejected in order to build relationships. Because every now and then you're going to find 60 people who really care, who will come after church and sit and listen to this guy to talk about this stuff because you really have a heart for making change. Now, the second thing I want you to understand about this racism thing as a system is what they call the Gun Control Act. Gun control has never been about guns. It's always been about populations. By 1672, it became legal to wound or kill an enslaved person who resists arrest. Legislators also deemed that the owner of any slave killed as he resisted arrest will receive financial compensation for the loss of the enslaved labor. Wait a minute, let me get this straight. So I run away, you kill me, and then the government pays you because I'm dead? Now, raise your hand if you do that. Right? Now, what some scholars argue is that is what we now call qualified immunity. Right? You know what qualified immunity is? Qualified immunity is if you commit some kind of a killing or a murder while you're doing your job as an officer of the law, you're immune. Didn't know that, did you? Boy, this guy's something, man. He's teaching y'all something. Right? Right? Legislators also offer a reward to Indians who captured escaped slaves and returned them to justice. In 1680, Virginia's General Assembly is supposed to meet in gatherings, including funerals. It became legal for a person to kill an slave who resisted capture. Slaves also are forbidden to arm themselves for either offensive or defensive purposes. So gun control is not about guns, it's about population control. If you keep those oppressed people from being able to protect themselves, we can come in and burn your house down. We can come in and kill your kids. We can come in and molest your women. Now, why is that important? Because that's about a system. That's why you have to differentiate the difference between race, racist, and racism. We watched a video last week where this young white guy meets this Asian woman, and he says to her, "Man, your English is perfect. Where are you from?" And I asked you, was he racist? And we had a number of different answers. And I argue, I don't think he was racist. I think he was just ignorant. Because there are people who make those kinds of statements, and actually they are compliments. I've had that, Dr. Caesar, man, you sure do speak well. Well, I've been in school most of my life. I should, right? But it was a compliment. It wasn't meant to. And so another thing we have to be able to do, here's the second point, is allow people to be undereducated without consequence. If you've not been exposed, I can't expect you to know some of this stuff. I have to be able to say, what was in her heart? What was in his heart? What were they really trying to say? Were they a compliment or were they being condemning, right? Because sometimes people say things and the intent is not to be malicious. The intent can sometimes be complimentary. I think he was complimenting her. I think he's trying to hit on her too, right? I think, right, he's trying to get the digits. But IG, TikTok, phone number. You got, okay, right over your head, right? So we have to learn to allow people to be undereducated without condemning them. Because, and the reason I brought up Sue's is in that particular class, I think it was the same class, one of our students came out as transgender. Was it in your class? Yeah. So I created this thing called the 90-second vent, where because the students were getting Zoom fatigue, they had 90 seconds every time we met to vent. Can't pay my school bill, trying to kill my dog, my mom driving me crazy, whatever case may be. Because one student says, they come out transgender and they say, I have never been able to talk to my parents about this. But Dr. Stevenson, you have created the kind of environment where I feel comfortable. And I don't know if you remember, the last day of class, give me a cry now. Last day of class, I'm giving the closing lecture, and all of a sudden, all the screens go black. So I thought the Wi-Fi went out, right? And then they all come back up and they have these signs that said how much they appreciated what I was saying to them, right? I think that kindness and love overrides all that other stuff. And if we say we love God, how can we say we love God and not love the people that God created? It doesn't matter what your differences are. It does not matter what your sexual orientation is or what your skin or whether you have hair or not. That doesn't matter. What we are human. And in order for us to build coalition, we have to start there. Now, obviously, there are going to be people who are recalcitrant, right? You know the word recalcitrant? Okay. You're pretty sharp. I'm telling you right now, this is good stuff right here, right? You're going to have people who are recalcitrant. And there are some people who just won't change. Nothing you can do about that. But then you're going to meet that one that changes your life. The second thing, and I just started this year, One of my consistent assignments is that every weekend, because my classes are Tuesdays and Thursday, my students have to do something that makes them smile. That's their homework assignment. So when they come in Tuesday, which is the longest class, everyone gets a chance to tell us what they did to make themselves smile. Because I'm trying to teach them balance. We live in a very stressful society. Gender stress, financial stress, racial stress, age stress. You name it, we got it. And who's creating the space for us to fellowship with one another? So every week they have to do something, and you'd be surprised what these kids will do. Sometimes as long as they're X-rated, I don't care, but right? Here's my point. Fellowship is a way of building camaraderie. And oftentimes, if these students don't get a chance to cross their fraternal lines, their sorority lines, their gender lines, etc., they're like this, right? And I think sometimes we as professors don't give our students a chance to understand we haven't always been professors. We didn't start out like this, right? And that in order for them to be successful, that they have to have a better balance in life. And likewise, when you start thinking about crossing cultures and crossing racial lines and building coalition, you make sure you keep doing something that makes you smile, because this is really hard work. If it were easy, everyone would do it, right? How much time I got? Okay. Okay. Does anyone know where Timbuktu is? That is? Northern Africa, go ahead. Now, what do we know about it, though? It's a song. Okay, what else? It's far away. 700,000 handwritten documents in Timbuktu before the 10th century. The largest library ever found was found not in Rome, not in Greece, but in Africa. And a significant number of those documents were written by, say it with me, women. Oh, didn't know that, did you? See, right? Cartography, astronomy, maps, biology, how to use certain vegetables for medicine, right? Now, here's the question. Why didn't you know that? Where was the second largest library found? I'll tell you later. Alexandria, which is in, because Egypt is not the Middle East, right? It's Africa. Now, why don't we know these? Obviously, these questions are rhetorical, but what I'm trying to show to you, what I'm trying to say to you is this. If you understand the role that other people, other genders, etc., pour into your life, you have a higher level of respect for them. I start, my first master's degree is in biblical studies. And you know who St. Augustine was? Okay, I'll tell you my story. All right. Okay. African. Right. So in Mark chapter 15, there's a story about this man named Simon of Cyrene. He carries a cross for Jesus. Where is Cyrene? It's Libya. It's Africa. So wait a minute, let me get this straight. A Black person carried the cross for Jesus? That changed my whole understanding of biblicity. Because when I grew up, at least in the 60s, and maybe I did it too, we had the white Jesus, we had John F. Kennedy, and we had Martin Luther King on the wall, right? With the velvet and the plastic on the chair. Some of y'all too young for that. You remember you sit in that chair, you get stuck, you can't get up, right? Right? I said, Mom, you got to take that white Jesus down. Right? Now, here's the point. It wasn't about race. It was about the information. And why do we constantly deprive people of information? Because you cannot control a person who is educated. And that's where I think we are right here in Florida today. We're in a space where people are constantly being undereducated because that's how you control the masses. But if you start educating people, if you say to them, hey man, on the inside, I'm just like you. Remember the experiment we did about the blood types? That's a whole different narrative, right? Someone said to me, would I come back and preach? Yeah, I come back here every other week if y'all want. Okay. Yes. Right? Because fellowship is fellowship. It can't be, if we really love God, it can't be superficial stuff. It's gotta be because we are learning to love one another. Right? So I'm gonna give you one more point and then I'm gonna open up for questions because I know we only had like 35 minutes. Right? There are three basic reasons for America's racial and sexual quandary. One, we tend not to discuss issues that don't affect us. Right? If it's not my problem, I don't really care. Right? If it's not my issue, I don't really care. Let me tell you why. So I had a brother, he's 2 years younger than me. He died of AIDS. I actually preached his funeral. And in those days, we didn't really understand homosexuality. And we didn't know. I mean, it was my dad, he couldn't figure it out. Right? But it gave me a sensitivity for the things I didn't understand and the things that didn't affect me. And so I began to study more about gender and these kinds of issues because I never wanted to feel uncomfortable about someone who made a different choice than me. I don't really care who you are, right? I care, do you treat me like a human being? That's it. You know, I don't really care as long as you're not trying to harm me and my family, we can hang out. I didn't start there. It was a journey. And it was a deliberate journey. It doesn't happen by accident. Second thing is, people don't want to be blamed or accused. One of the things I said last week is, this is not a blaming section. I will never do that. I won't ever do that. As a matter of fact, in my classes, there are several rules of engagement. One, there are no dumb questions. Two, I never tell my students that's a wrong answer. I will say to them, well, have you thought about this? Or I will provide them with some more information and say, okay, does that change what you think now? Because you can only answer a question based on what you've been exposed to. If you don't know this stuff, I can't expect you to give a right answer. And what I don't want you to do is shut down. I don't want you to stop coming because you feel that if I can't raise my hand and engage, then I'm going to be condescended to. The third thing is we don't have the linguistic tools to engage in these conversations. We don't know how to talk to each other. We just don't. I was talking to someone and she said, when I said last week, I want you to bring your people, I didn't mean that negatively. I knew that, right? But you hear what I'm saying? The assumption was my people is different than your people, right? But what she was saying to me is, won't you bring some of your congregation along? That wasn't intentionally modest. That's the best way she knew how to talk about it. And so if we can begin to apply these principles to the way we react and interact with each other, I promise you, it will change not only the way we see each other, but the way we coalesce. And my desire is to see ministries and communities and people groups crossing one another because you know more about each other. My wife and I have a very healthy relationship. One, she knows everything about me, the good stuff and the not so good stuff. Two, I won't. when I first met her, and I'll close with this, I had taken her out. Did I tell you about this? I took her out and she drove my truck. Because if she stole the truck, she probably could, she wasn't the one, right? But, right? We have to learn there's okay to trust. It's okay to fail. It's okay not to know. And it's okay to be rejected. Because every time someone rejects you, that opens the door for someone else to accept you. And I had to learn that. And that's why I'm here. That's why I came back, right? I came back because I sensed that there is a yearning in this group where people really want to know better. And I believe that part of what God has called me to be and to do is to be one of those bridges. Not the only bridge, right? But one of those bridges. Because you have children, you have grandchildren. How many, who has great grands? I have two great granddaughters. And I'm telling you right now, they will never, they won't get married while I'm living because I'm not gonna let them date because these guys, I'm like, don't even think about it. But, you know, what are we gonna leave the world to? What kind of environment will our great grandchildren grow up in if you and I don't fix this? Right? Amen. God bless you. Thank you. We'll open it up for questions. Questions?
I have two if it's okay. One is, louder? Okay, should I take it off? Should I raise it up?
Can you get it?
In the 1970s, I was at UF. I'd graduated with a degree in English, got a job for a little while at the university, and it. Oh, this isn't working. Okay. So I had a job at UF. One day there was a dean, African-American dean, who brought a paper over. He knew I had a degree in English. He said, would you go over this and correct it for me, make some corrections? In my enthusiasm, I got my red pen, being very naive, made all these corrections, gave it back to him. The next day, a woman administrative assistant who found out about this and saw it, who was studying linguistics, came up to me and completely chewed me out, screaming at me. And at the time, there was this right, person's right to their own language. And so she thought I was doing something that was disrespecting his right to use his own language. Of course, we know that standard English is so important in terms of publication, everything else, but I'm wondering whatever happened to some of those things. I mean, in terms of,
I mean, like Ebonics?
Yeah, well, just this idea of how important it is when we want to educate people and the ability to use language that is the standard language in our country.
Okay, I don't know if there has been a dissipation of it. I grade my students' papers as well. There is a difference between oral and verbal communication and written communication. As a matter of fact, my students have to write papers throughout the semester and then give presentations in the class because I'm teaching them how to speak publicly. So I don't know whether this woman understood what you were trying to accomplish or not. If he asked you to grade the paper and to read the paper, he did that because he respected you, right? So what that other person said, as in my mind, was irrelevant. It really was.
I always felt like it.
Yeah, I think that's irrelevant.
The other thing is I've always been interested in period piece movies from like the 1800s, England, that kind of thing, like Pride and Prejudice, etc. Recently, there have been some new movies that have come out And I know that the history of racism and how it shows up is very different in America as opposed to Europe. But if anybody else has noticed too, there's some recent movies where all of a sudden they have African Americans or African people playing parts in these movies that are almost like that there's no distinction in social classes. And I look at it and I think, well, on the one hand, I'm happy for these people to have jobs. And I'm happy on some part of me to see this. But then I'm also curious about, is this an attempt to erase how it really was by let's create period pieces from that period that are misrepresenting
Sure.
how it was
Sure.
historically.
Well, I think that, thank you for your question. I think that entertainment, like any field, has the potential to gloss over, to try to make an event not as bad at romanticize. If you get a minute, you know what a TED Talk is? Okay. I did a TED Talk on the Middle Passage. So you can look it up. And one of the things I talk about is the romanticization of history, right? There's a show my wife and I binged. It's called Fool Me Once. And you've seen it, okay? And there are a number of black people in it, right? Matter of fact, the head police officer, his partner was a black woman, okay? And what we fail to realize historically is during the slave trade, a number of African kings who sent their children to England to learn because, okay, let me do it this way. You ready for this? What do you call someone who speaks 3 languages? Awesome. What do you call someone who speaks 2 languages? What do you call someone who speaks 1 language? American. Right? Now here's the point. One of the things that we learned from those kind of period movies is slave ships had linguists on board because the English didn't speak Yoruba or Igbo or Shanti or Iwe, right? They had carpenters so they could reconfigure the ship, and they had surgeons. And so there was this intercourse between Britain and the Netherlands, like it is now with Africa and China, where they're learning to speak these different languages so they can communicate in regards to economics. So I don't know if the intent of shows you're talking about is to gloss over. I think it's just to show a better reality, because there were a number of you may have heard of Aulado Equiano. He was a enslaved person who escaped and then wrote his own history, went back to England, learned English, and began to write his own history, right? And so we have that concept. And so I do believe that part of it is to give a better picture. Has it been glossed? Maybe. Romanticized? Possibly. But I think it's also trying to show that there were other relationships cross-culturally, et cetera, that existed that helped to make whatever that country is so on survive. Okay? Yes, sir.
Thanks for being here. As you know, in the state of Florida, we have, let's say, people in positions of power who are doing things that are affecting our education system. And I wanted to invite you to talk a little bit about any things that we can do to help implement improving that.
Thank you. It's a great question. I'm a historian. And so one of the things I try to do primarily is to deal with primary sources. So you saw the book in the video UDC, right? They tried to rewrite history. Well, one of the ways of getting around that is by introducing your kids to primary source data. So if you try to argue that slavery was not reason that Florida succeeded from the Union, All you have to do is go back and read the succession letter. It says in the letter that they are succeeding because they want to make things is introducing our young people to primary sources. My students are required in some of my classes to read primary sources and then use exegetical methods to examine these documents. So it's not just secondary and tertiary sources, but I want them to read the Constitution. I want them to read the succession. I want them to read slave narratives, right? So that they have access to it. You remember, scholars couldn't travel. We couldn't go to foreign countries and do research. So what happened? The archivists started digitizing this data. So now you can sit in your living room with your PJs on and you can tap into the Kew Library in England. You can tap into the archives in Pretoria. You can go into Spain's library and read these documents. So what we can do is we can supplement, right, what they're getting. If the schools can't teach it, fine. We teach it. Now, why is that important? You ever heard of the African Church? Between 1866 and 1888, 70 HBCUs were started by, say it with me, so the church has the see. Somebody can't tell the church not to teach history, right? The churches can begin, like we used to do, to teach this stuff, right? The laws are not only against the churches, they're about the schools, okay? We fix that, right? Because if you remember, I know you're standing for a minute, the synagogues were what? They were schools. Show us. So why not go back to it? They can't prevent us from teaching this stuff. Otherwise, if they could, I wouldn't be here. Question? Yes, sir.
All right, thank you. I think we have a call for a new small group, maybe. Thanks for being here. I have a similar question about education, and I appreciate you talking about we lack the language to discuss what's going on, but you said we're undereducated, right? But I'm still very confused about what's going on in Florida by the suppression of history. What do we call that? I mean, what's going on?
Yeah.
I don't know how to discuss it.
Okay, so first of all, do you know what critical race theory is? What is it?
Graduate level theory.
Okay, so critical race theory is a second-year law course. And critical race theory came into existence to examine how the laws function differently in Black communities as opposed to white communities. It was never about making white kids feel any way about their history, right? One of the first rules of critical race theory is racism is normal. Right? And race is a social construct. It is. The third is what we call material determinism or interest convergence. This is where the rub comes. Interest convergence says this, that poor whites, middle class whites, and rich whites, their interests will converge to hold down people of color. Now, what you fail to realize is billionaire whites don't like poor whites either. They don't. Where do you think white trash came from? No, I'm serious. I'm trying to help you now. But what happens is, if you can use CRT as a dog whistle, then people will vote against their own interests to make sure these other people don't get up. Give you an example. This guy says to a person, what do you feel about Obamacare? I don't want that because, he's Black president, So then they said, well, what about the Affordable Care Act? Oh, we want that. It's the same thing. You know what I'm saying? So what made it different? Obama. You see what I'm saying? And so we have to be so critical when we hear these dog whistles because it's all right. So what's happening? Fine. The history of census is demonstrating that by 2035, there will be a significant browning of America. And people of other ethnic groups tend to vote Democratic. Not always, but because you do know the Republican Party was founded by Lincoln and Black people. So what happened? That's a whole nother lesson, right? So these dog whistles are more about making sure power stays in a certain group than it's about education. If you really understand critical race theory, another one of the tenets is storytelling. How do you learn other people's experiences if you don't tell stories? So it's not as bad as we think it is. But the way it's been promoted, and because we watch it on news and we don't do the reading, we have no idea. That makes sense? So I think that part of this educational thing, again, is about depriving people from the kind of data that will allow them to make critical analysis and critical decisions. And we don't want that because we cannot control people who think for themselves. Right? Yes, ma'am. Last question.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that it takes years and years for white people to unlearn what they've learned. And I was raised in Texas, and we definitely were taught the lost cause. We didn't recognize it for what it was. I had a history teacher in high school that told about how, her grandmother danced in the streets in Nashville when Lincoln was assassinated, and, on and on. And I felt I was an educated person, but then when I started going to college, I started reading more. But the thing that brought home to me that I had a lot to learn and I'd better learn it fast. I had children very young, so I was in my early 30s, and my son comes home from school and starts talking about they're studying the Civil War and starts talking about us and them. In my mind, I thought us meant the South. And I said I said, you mean the South, us? And he said, no, Mom, the United States is us. Them are who left, and he gave me the whole lecture. So it takes a long time. So that was when I was 30, and now I'm 80. So, so anyway, so it takes a long time to unlearn all of that, and you have to study and, we've got to do something about, like you say, teaching American history through our churches.
Hey, man, come on, give yourself a round of applause. Yes, sir.
Seminar in February, so in a month, we're gonna have a seminar on banning of books in the school.